Hi, it's Lisa here. We are on week 2, lesson 2, winning the favor of others in our Esther study. Hopefully you've had a couple weeks to kind of settle into what is this going to look like for you in the season, whether you've decided to walk this out with a girlfriend, or maybe you're doing this in your group, or you've started a group, or you're just in a season where God is wanting to equip you and how you lead yourself spiritually in this season. Whatever that looks like for you, hopefully you are getting the emails that Jenny is sending and you're kind of understanding how we're setting up these videos for you each week, that the teaching time follows up with the time that you have spent in that lesson with God during the week, and that the discussion then is for you to have with your group or those relationships that you're doing Esther with, where you can talk about the lesson and the teaching video together. And I believe God's going to have some great discussion and really add to what I'm able to even teach on in this short amount of time. So I'm so excited about our lesson this week, lesson 2. I was thinking about a verse. I'm going to read it out of 2 Corinthians 2:15 through 16. It says, "For we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one a fragrance from death to death, and to the other a fragrance from life to life." And as I was thinking about this verse this morning, I couldn't help but notice on my dresser some perfume I have. I don't wear perfume every day, but certainly for special occasions I do wear perfume. And one of the things that I've always done before I put perfume on is I always shake it. I don't know why, it's just something I've always done. I shake it. And immediately when you begin to shake it, you can begin to smell that aroma, that flavor that you're about to put on. This is Juicy Couture. I've had this probably for 20 years. I wonder if there's a shelf life for perfume. I don't think so. But anyways, I can, without even squirting the perfume bottle, just from shaking it, it's all Juicy Couture going on right here. And I was thinking about just this visual picture in that verse, and I was just thinking about our current world right now, and maybe even in your personal worlds right now. There is a lot that's shaking us. You know, the news is shaking us. The pandemic is shaking us. I don't know if you happen to watch the presidential debate. I'm sure that was shaking many of us who were watching that. Our personal lives are shaking us. Maybe it's our finances. Maybe it's relationships. Maybe it's receiving unexpected news that you weren't expecting. And I believe that when we are shaken, we can really see where our faith is at, depending on how we respond to the things that are shaking us. And we all have different things that are shaking us right now. Because what that reveals is what is internally inside of us. So maybe when you are shaken, or when you've gone through some of these circumstances this year, fear is coming out, or worry, or distrust, or control. And all of those things just indicate an internal condition to how we are viewing our perception of an external world. I just am so grateful that despite all of the things that we are seeing and what we're not seeing, that God is still in control of the affairs of the world, and that He is doing something right now, that He is working. He is not at all surprised by the craziness of this pandemic or COVID or politics or all the issues of our day. In fact, He is committed to bringing good out of any harm that's been done to you and I. He's intending to bring good out of any circumstance that we walk through for the good of us, but also the good of the gospel. But He is calling us, His church, women of influence, to step out and trust Him. He's asking us, inviting us, would you be vessels of hope and freedom and life? So that when you're shooken up, as others are shooken up, the aroma that would come out of you would be different than the aroma that's coming out of people that don't know me. Christians have been called to be set apart from the world, and we've been called to live differently, think differently, respond differently. And it's not our work that makes us different. It's the work of the Holy Spirit. as we relinquish control and abide in that power, are we able then to produce something so much different? That despite all the craziness, the aroma that we can set forth in this world is an aroma that's peaceful and gentle and unmoved by what we're seeing, gracious and loving and kind. And so that's kind of the question I want to ask us as we dive into Esther 2 today is, what kind of aroma is coming out of you depending on what you're encountering this week and in your circumstances? And is that aroma winning the favor of people that God has strategically placed you and I around to be an influence with the gospel? And as we look at the book of Esther and we begin to meet Esther and see her walk this faith journey out, we see things in her that help us identify ways that we can also make some changes currently so that we are living in a way that sets us apart from the world, or affirming some of the ways that we're living that out, just as Esther did. But how did she win the favor? Through the aroma of her faith in God. And how can we do that as well? And I love the setting of this book, because the book of Esther was written during a time where the Jews were wondering, where is God? Has he abandoned us? Is he still at work? Has he forsaken or forgotten us? I mean, their lives were completely rocked when they were taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar and sent into captivity in those three different through those three different places that they were exiled to. They felt abandoned, I am sure, by God. And so the big question was, while they maybe felt those things, was God still working? Was he still moving forward his promises that he had promised Israel in Genesis 12 with that covenant that he made with Abraham? And is that same biblical principle true for us today when we look at the affairs of our world? Is God still working, and are his promises still moving forward, his kingdom purposes, as we see the gospel be advanced through us, women who are invited to be an influence every day? So this book, again, is designed to show God's providential care through the people of Israel. And here's the interesting thing. You will never see God's name mentioned in this book. But the hand of God, the ruling over the affairs of the events, and the preservation of his people can be seen throughout this entire book. Providence is a theme of Esther, and I want to just give you a quick definition so that you can keep that in the back of your mind as we're studying the rest of this book. But it is the preservation, care, and government that God exercises over all the things that he's created, in order that they may accomplish the ends for which they were created. God will always use the natural laws of this world to accomplish his will. And his will from the beginning of time is to redeem people, the brokenness of what sin has caused, putting that enmity between mankind and God. He wants to restore and redeem people. He wants to save people from death. And he's calling the church, you and I, to be Esthers, to be the vessels that will save people from the death, the annihilation that sin can have in their life. So this is kind of the big picture. Now let's go into the narrative of Esther 2. We're going to look at some great things that we learn through Esther and also what we learn about God. So just the way I divided that chapter, I kind of broke it up into three places. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 14 is really the search for the new queen, right? It's inside the palace, what took place inside the palace. 15 through 20 is a selection of Esther as queen. And then the final verses 21 through 23, is it the steps taken for Mordecai to save the king. And that happened outside the palace. So the distance between chapter 1 and chapter 2, if you remember, as we ended in chapter 1, is that King Xerxes had made a real mess out of a situation by parading Queen Vashti, wanting to parade Queen Vashti in his drunken stupor, and she stood him up, and the result of that for her was he banished her. He wanted to make a message out of her mistake. And so the kingdom is now without a queen. We're also seeing in this Persian kingdom just the ways that culture and paganism and idolatry and opulence really ruled the value system of this culture. Now, between chapter 1 and chapter 2, if you look at historical documents, you see that King Xerxes went to Greece to try and take possession of Greece, and he actually was a defeat for him. And so he's been 4 years away from the kingdom, fighting a war against Greece, which he didn't win. He comes back, and in chapter 2, not only is he suffering the defeat of a battle, but he's also suffering the mistake of the consequences he made 4 years prior by giving up a queen and now having a kingdom without a queen. So it says in Esther 2:1, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what the decree had been against her. So all of this has subsided, and I see that there's just kind of some regret in King Xerxes' decision that he had made. And I don't know about you, but I can either point my finger at King Xerxes about, poor judgment call he made, bad decision he made and suffering the consequences, or I can also allow God to remind me of my own decisions that I've made where I can kind of relate. There's decisions that I've made where I'm sitting in the consequences of those decisions. And this is really powerful because I think it's going to show us, but God still wants to use us, but God still wants to work even through those decisions that we make apart from God's best. So not wanting the king to be depressed anymore, his advisors, those guys that told him to get rid of Vashti, propose a way to try and lift the king's spirits by holding basically the Miss Persia pageant. Now this was the pageant of all pageants. There were 400 virgins that were selected in the whole kind of Susa kingdom, and they would be paraded not paraded at this point, but they would come in for a year to prepare for this pageant before the king. It says in verses 2 through 4, then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who would be the custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. So again, we can read this, but we have to read it through a cultural lens and understand that this was very customary for kings back then to have harems. It was very customary for kings to select queens, just as King Xerxes is doing, where these women would be gathered up for a year to prepare their beauty regimens, to prepare their bodies to be displayed for the king, and whoever would be, win the favor of the king, would be picked to be the queen. It's also interesting to note that it was a year because they also wanted to make sure that not one of those virgins that they thought they selected was pregnant. So in verse 2:7, we finally meet our beautiful Esther. It says, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. We learn that Mordecai is from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was a legal guardian of Esther, whose parents had died. And it says in verse 8 that she was taken to the harem. basically indicating that these women had no choice. It wasn't, get this invite, would you like to be part of the Miss Persia pageant? These women were taken against their will, and it was no different for Esther. It was the law. Now, one of the things that we see in verse 8 quickly, so when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken in the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the woman. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. So we know that Esther is put in charge, entrusted to Haggai. In the following verse, we know that she has won the favor. Immediately, there was something set apart in this woman that immediately captured Haggai's attention. And it says that quickly he provided her with her cosmetics, a year's supply to Ulta, whatever she wanted, and her portion of food, and was given 7 chosen young women to be her servants from the king's palace. And so she basically, of those 400 women that were selected, not only had the favor from from Haggai, but also she was quickly influencing all of the other women around her. Now, one of the things that we need to pay attention to in verses 10 through 11 is that she was told not to reveal her ethnicity. Remember, Esther is a Jew. These are her people. Her people, most of them had already made their way back towards Jerusalem, but it was this remnant, 6 million to be exact, that were still living in the Persian Empire as captives. Yet they had been given the green light to go and be with their people. So they were hiding their identity at this point. They were also living not as God had commanded them to be set apart, but they were living more blended into the culture of that time. And this was not how God had instructed Jews to behave. But in this verse, she was told by Uncle Mordecai not to let her identity be known. And I just think it's interesting. When I read that, I was like, wow, basically, she's kind of lying. She seems like she's disobeying the Mosaic law and the way Jesus had instructed Israel to set themselves apart. But for whatever reason, this was the course of action she took. But we still see, despite her disobedience and Mordecai's disobedience, we still see the kindness of God at work. She was given this favor. We observe that it was her inner beauty that really won the affections of Haggai and ultimately the king. And we see in verse 17 that the king loved Esther more than anyone. It says here in verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. He put the royal crown on Esther's head, and she became queen after 1 year. Then the king gave a feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Wow, that is an amazing turn in events. How does this exiled, orphan, unseen girl rise up to take the throne as a queen? Who does that? You see, despite the disobedience, despite the ways that Israel had not returned back as God had called them back to, despite their disobedience, despite the ways that they were more comfortable blending in the Persian culture, God still was committed to moving forth his promises. And that Israel would be saved. And it would be this woman and the courage and the boldness of this woman and Uncle Mordecai that would move forward God's purposes for this. So I want to just stop right here and just make some observations about Esther. I'm going to take my crown off, but I just wanted to make a point here. First of all, we see what is inside of her. As I was talking earlier, as we get shooken up when we're faced and confronted with unexpected things and trials and sufferings and disappointment. I mean, basically, let's be honest, friends, 2020 in general. What are the things that come out? What are the things that came outside of Esther as she was shooken up? And what are the things that we want God to bring out of us when we get shooken up? We see that she was humble. She entered this drama as an exile. She was orphaned. We see that she cared more about people than winning her own position. We don't see this aggressive drama girl that's going in to make sure that she's queen. She's just available. She doesn't quite understand what God is doing. She's just making herself available to live her faith out in that present moment. And in that present moment, what she knew she was called to do was just to love people around her, which was Haggai and all of these other women that were in that pageant. We also see that she respected her elders. Uncle Mordecai, well, now we can question whether that was the right thing to do to hide her identity. In that moment, that is what they knew what to do and what they chose to do. But we see her just respecting her Uncle Mordecai. Clearly there was a relationship where he really did come in and treat her as her own daughter. And then we also see that she used her assets to influence others. God had created this beautiful woman, and she had, physically, she had beautiful assets that drew people to her. And she didn't use that to just elevate her own position. We see that she really used that to elevate the position of others. Some of the best advice I ever got years ago when I was teaching in a middle school was someone said, make every effort you can to befriend the janitor, the custodian, those people on your school campus that are going to be there for you when you need that extra favor. And so I went above and beyond. It wasn't the principal that I was seeking recognition for. It was the people that were maybe low on the totem pole and on the salary schedule that I made an effort to care for and to affirm and to develop a friendship with. And I'm going to say it really came in handy in some of those moments when you needed extra chairs or a light or help with technology. So that's what Esther was doing. She had won the favor of Haggai, and I believe Haggai helped position some things for Esther so that she would be seen by the king. So those are some things we learn about Esther, but what do we learn about God? You know, God, whose name is not mentioned in this book, but whose work and character, his attributes are woven into every verse that we read. Esther and Mordecai's disobedience, that he works in that to accomplish his purposes. It didn't thwart God's plans and what he had prepared for Esther to do. God knew from the beginning of time that it would be Esther he would call for such a time as this to intercede and save a people from annihilation. Esther didn't know that. And so those mistakes that she made never took Esther off God's path for where he wanted to use her and where she would be. We also see that tradition and culture and the ways that this society was set up would never have used a commoner like Esther to be a queen. They would never stand a chance. But we also see that God trumps all of the ways that man tries to run and control the affairs of this world. Yes, we have systems and we have government and we have structures in place, but it is never going to trump what God is going to do to move forward his plans. That is, for me right now, that's a comfort to know that. We also know about God that he does not reveal his entire plan for us at once. If Esther knew what God had planned for her, I think she might have run very far away. But he revealed one step at a time what she needed to do, and she faithfully steps into those opportunities and obeys God. And her faith is strengthened. You're going to see that as we study throughout the rest of this book. God uses the fleshly desires of pagan culture and people that are far from God and unbelievers and evil people to accomplish his purposes. God works in dysfunction. Heck, he used Pharaoh to free an entire nation. He works regardless of whether we are choosing him or not. Our level of faith does not limit what God can do in and through us. He works through cultural values, but he is looking for obedient and humble hearts because his timing is perfect. And that's the opportunity that you and I have in this season to be humble and available for his Spirit to work through as we earn favor from people around us. And one of the ways that he continued to win favor for Mordecai to set this story up even more is Uncle Mordecai, we hear in those final verses, hears of a death plot against King Xerxes. It says, those last few chapters, he had two eunuchs that were wanting to kill him, and Uncle Mordecai heard that. And he told Esther, and Esther told the king, and those two guys were hung, crucified actually, severely punished for even trying to plot against the king. And it says in the last verse here, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So right here at the end of chapter 2, we see this being written in the book of Chronicles that's later in our story going to have a very significant moment for the king when we see that it's this Uncle Mordecai here that saves the king from death. So we have the opportunity 2,000 years later to see this whole story written and how God's hand is working, one thing leading to another, his providence. But hopefully it helps you understand that this same God is doing the same thing through your life as well, that he is providentially working through the affairs of our world to move forward his kingdom purposes, but also to move forward the purposes that he has for your life. As a daughter of the king, as a queen, you've been invited to be part of this kingdom. He is your king. Jesus is your king. And you are part of this kingdom. And we reign as daughters, as Esthers, given specific assets that give us a platform to influence people, to find favor in the people that God has strategically put all around us. So the question I want to leave you with as you dive into lesson 2 with your friends or your family member or mentoring, whatever that looks like for you, and maybe a little bit after this teaching time, the question I want you to consider is, as you're being shooken up, let's be honest here, we're going to be honest, what aroma are you setting forth in the relationships that God has put around you right now? What aroma? And if that aroma is toxic, if it's negative, if it's worry, if it's fearful, then that's an amazing opportunity for you to come before God humbly, to confess those things, to ask him to replace those things with the Spirit so that you can, next time you're shaken up, you can set forth an aroma that is set and grounded in his peace and in his hope and in his promises and in love and in grace, that we would not be thwarted or moved by whatever we see, because our trust is not in this world, but our trust is in the sovereignty of God, who's over all things, and he's working something out right now. We don't know what the end of this is going to look like, but girls, I tell you, God does, and he's even given us some great scriptures that help strengthen us that the end result is very, very good. As people come to faith through the affairs of this world. He's using the affairs of this world so that people would find him and know him and be saved from death. And we get to be part of that. I mean, I'm just kind of blown away that God would use me. I'm not perfect. I disobey. I get off the path. But God is still saying, Lisa, will you rise up right now and step in and be a vessel, be an aroma of the fragrance of Christ? Because our world more than ever needs that right now. So I'm going to let you now continue the conversation, and I know God will add to that. But thank you for continuing this journey. Don't stop now. We're just at Esther 2, and we've got some great things ahead for us. Have a great week. Bye-bye.